welcome to From Know to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology. And with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Limitless, a television show produced by National Geographic, is a docuseries that follows actor Chris Hemsworth as he consults with various experts in the field of longevity on how the body ages and how best to fight it. While the show provides ample entertainment in the form of extreme challenges meant to help Chris identify and improve areas of his physical and mental fitness, it also touches on philosophical themes throughout. The most powerful episode, and indeed the most powerful piece of television I've personally ever watched, is the last episode, which addresses the acceptance of death. Today we'll walk through the themes it presents. If you haven't seen the episode, don't worry. It isn't necessary to enjoy today's show. If you'd like to see it, feel free to hit pause, check it out on Disney+, and rejoin us when you're finished. So, I think the intro covers it pretty well.
Yes.
But after I watched it, it was just really such a powerful experience seeing it. And I immediately thought, we've got to look into this.
I agree. And the fact is, well, we've got the kind of relationship where you could say to me last week, after we did our podcast, hey, would you like to watch this episode? And so we did. And we sat on the couch, and your cat wasn't sure why I was there instead of your wife, but that was and we watched it. We watched it essentially in quiet, in silence, in contemplation, we weren't doing the every 2 seconds stopping and talking about it. And I think that was really good. First, because we're comfortable with each other. We know each other enough to do that. Second, because it allowed me to take it, and you as a second viewing, to take it in and just pay attention to exactly what was seemingly going on the screen. So it yields a lot of thought. I wanted to talk about this.
Yeah, and it really needs that kind of watch. And the thing that strikes me throughout it is just that there's a progression. There's a tangible progression throughout the episode, starting from the tone at the beginning, and then the things that Chris experiences throughout it, all the way to the conclusion at the end.
Yeah.
That's some of the stuff that we'll cover. So. A large focus of the show, at least the first half of it, is the aging suit. What did you find most interesting about the aging suit?
The aging suit, which essentially added 30 pounds to Chris Hemsworth and eyes, goggles that made his eyesight not good, plugs for ears, shoes that were not even, so he would not be able to walk with great confidence. And we talked about this on the side after, but it took me right back to an experience, one of the most profound experiences I ever had, working with my dear friend, the director of fine performing arts at the college I taught at. When we were doing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, arranged with the Mental Health Association, they have the cast go there and to experience for a few hours something simulating mental health conditions. And I had no idea what we were going to be doing until we got there. And this was some years ago, but 14 years ago. And they strapped essentially Walkman or CD players up to and put headsets on us. Told us ahead of time we were going to be experiencing through our ears what various mental health conditions from somebody who's described it from internally. So the whole thing was a setup for what people tell people they feel like when they're walking day to day. And we had different CDs that we were hearing. We weren't all experiencing the same thing. And while we were experiencing these things, we had to walk through a set of ordinary tasks. We had to do a math test. We had to do a job interview. We had to have a conversation with somebody, but in mine, there were the voices in the head constantly reminding me of how stupid I am, or how unable I am, why would I even think that I could do something like this? But this voice, and sometimes shouting, sometimes quiet, emulating what some people hear and their subconscious minds or their minds are saying to themselves, and trying to get through. I barely passed a 6th grade math test. First time through, I didn't. I couldn't fill out a complete form for a job in the time that was allowed. And I heard maybe a third of the questions and was not articulate. Not that I ever am, but I usually am a little more articulate than I was in that circumstance. And it was demeaning. It was embarrassing. It was overwhelming emotionally. And we had a debrief afterward to try to pull us back out of this. And we were all just silent at the table, looking at the table, occasionally glancing at each other. And we left in quiet. And we said a very quiet good night to each other. And we talked about it the next rehearsal. So we weren't just left, but you just don't emerge from something like that and say, well, okay, fine. And the reason I described that at some length is because that's what I saw happening with Chris Hemsworth with that suit. Here is somebody who's extremely physically trained to look like a superhero and goes through excruciating work. I can't even read about what some of these folks go through. And as you've said before, this is not somebody who's going to be running long distances with that kind of weight of muscles. But here he was fighting this as if it were something that he could get past. If he could just master the suit, it would be okay, sort of an Iron Man thing.
Yeah.
But you can't. And this is why I was deeply moved by the thing, because I was sitting there thinking to him, I mean, I'm 65. He's 39. And I'm there thinking at him, no, you can't beat this. It's not going. So that was fascinating.
Yeah. I think that it is, when you watch it, it really is very cool, because from the second he puts it on, it's just wild. This suit is engineered by MIT, and it looks ridiculous, right? He's wearing a bike helmet, he's got bungees hooked up to him and all this stuff. But because of the shoes that make him unbalanced and the earplugs and the glasses that simulate old age eyesight and things, you watch him move around, he looks like an 80-year-old man.
And he can't hear half of what people are saying to him.
The simulation is very convincing. You see this giant, muscular Chris Hemsworth just moving around like an old guy.
Yeah.
But early in the episode, like you said, even though the movements and the five, the senses are dulled, the spirit or the attitude is still that of a young, that of a young man, right?
Yes, of course.
And he goes through some things that demonstrate that, that's not the way to think of it. The Dr. B.J. Miller, who kind of walks through the entire experiment, says, there's 3 stages where, people try to fight the suit, and then they try to adapt to it, and then they accept it, right? And I think the thing that stuck out to me the most about it was that, yes, as you watch him, and then as you see, what he faces, you go, okay, well, that's not an approach that's going to work. But at the same time, you really have to ask yourself, is there any other approach to take, right? I mean, you can't fight aging, and you can adapt to aging so far, but eventually it's going to get the better of you. But does that mean that fighting it and adapting to it isn't the right approach to take to begin with, right?
Yeah, and that's why I'm glad you bring that up, because I think that if I have any, well, it's not a criticism in the negative sense, but it certainly raises the issue. There was a death doula, and I have a lot of respect for people who do this. It's not always women. It's not always men. It's people. It can be trans folk. It can be anybody. But death doula is somebody he encounters in the second and third days. But the whole approach seemed to be, don't fight this, accept this. But I think that calls to me philosophically to challenge what the word fight means
Hmm.
and what the word accept means. And I more times than I'm not proud of it, but I would often do joshing with students, especially on the stage, or directing a children's theater show, and somebody would say, "Well, you're not going to be teaching forever." I said, "I'm not teaching forever, but I'm going to be alive forever. You know that." Well, I know that. I know I'm going to be alive forever, but it's not a denial of mortality to embrace the energy you have in whatever stage of life you are at. And even the idea of stages of life bothers me. And I know you've been studying all kinds of things psychologically. I find it troubling that there are the expectations of how one would behave. And this episode was talking about how one can adapt and accept, but adapting and accepting don't have to mean not fighting, and fighting doesn't have to be being a warrior or something. Fighting may be not the right word, but resisting by keeping oneself as active as possible and doing the things that keep one alive mentally and physically. If I call that resisting and somebody else calls that adapting, then we've got a semantic thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that the intro to this episode does a good job demonstrating that. They kind of do a quick montage recap of the previous episodes where, Chris is conquering the sea and he's
climbing a skyscraper.
Yeah, he's doing all these crazy things. And then, he's talking and he goes, "So what am I going to do to conquer death?" And he goes, "Well, I guess this." And he's walking through the episode. But yeah, I think that's right. There's this dichotomy of this notion of fighting, right? You think of the poem Rage, Rage Against the Dying of the Light, right?
Yes.
And I think that it is important to dive into what that means, right? If you're looking at it as, okay, well, just don't accept death. Just fight against it as long as you can until it overtakes you, right? Well, that's one thing.
Yeah.
It's another thing to, accept death is coming, but take all of the actions you can to try to live a good life up until that point, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very fine distinction. It's something that's difficult to identify.
Someone just unspeakably dear to me is going through an experience that will end in death. Well, all of our lives do. But is adamant that this is not about being a warrior. Don't tell me I'm fighting. I'm not fighting anything. And I honor that. And I don't think one is a warrior in facing death either. I don't find that useful. So that's not the kind of thing I mean when this is why it's important to talk about these things.
Yeah, because it presents it as a zero-sum game, right? If you put it in the context of fighting, then you are 100% of the time a loser. We all are a loser. And that's not really the right way to think about death.
It isn't. It isn't because, and this is where we get into this classical philosophy. Right from the start, the first Western philosopher that we are aware of, and we're talking about 600 BC, Thales was talking about the inevitability. Epicurus we've talked about before, and Epicurus said, well, essentially, there's no point worrying about this because you can't understand it when you're alive, and when you're gone, you're not going to be thinking about it. And that's all well and good, but that's all still talking about the physical nature, and then it brings up the nature of consciousness, which I know we're going to get to with all kinds of questions. But one of the questions that I find myself asking a lot as I think about this, because I wake up each morning and I don't have a ritual statement, but I wake up and I rub my eyes and say, "Oh, sunrise through the window, and look, here's today, got today." But I don't even know if I have all of today. None of us knows that. But I don't find it helpful I wouldn't find it helpful to go through the day thinking, oh, is it going to happen now? Oh, how about now? What? No, that's the way to absolute insanity.
Yeah.
Unhingement, I think. So you have life, but you're not going to do anything with life except thinking, oh, it's almost done. It's almost done. We don't know that. So I think to acknowledge the moment and try to live in the moment as best one can, and none of us does that perfectly, and it's a very Zen thing, and it's yoga, and it's all those things. But I think once acknowledged, then you get on with it. What am I going to do today? What am I going to do with my granddaughter? Or what kind of art am I going to make today? Or who will I talk to? Will the conversations mean something?
Yeah.
Or am I going to fritter away a bunch of time just watching the stars? And I will, and I do, because it's because frittering is a word that suggests a whimsy and a waste, but that's only because of our capitalistic metaphors again. It's about not fighting, but also not capitulating to, in a sense of, as you say, the zero-sum game.
Yeah, that touched on so many of the themes of the episode. So we're going to talk about all this stuff going into it, but I want to circle back to where we started by talking about B.J. Miller's story of loss and relinquishing the past and embracing a new life. It's one of the most powerful scenes.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that struck me about it is it really sort of just puts out there this dichotomy, right? Because here's a guy who, he was a fit, handsome young guy going to Stanford, and at 19 years old, had an accident that resulted in, both of his legs and one of his arms getting amputated, and had a severe rehabilitation, and it took him years of just this mental anguish, right, of trying to struggle with who he was, after this accident. And, the conclusion that he came to was that he had to let that old idea of him die and accept this new person that he was. And, it's just a little thing that he says, but you can sense, not the desperation, but just I don't know what the word is, but if it's desperation, it's desperation that we all feel, not just him. But he said, I look in the mirror and I said, this is my life. This is it. Right. Yeah. And we all have to do that. Right. We all look in the mirror and say, regardless of our circumstances, whether we are lucky enough to be as physically and mentally and financially gifted as Chris Hemsworth, or whether we're somebody who has dealt with physical or emotional or mental anguish, we all have to look in the mirror and say, this is it. This is my life, right? Yeah. But the dichotomy, right, is that after he talks about this, it shows him climbing through the canyons with his prosthetic legs and his dog and doing these physical and active things that he could have done as the young, healthy man, and he's doing them. And you go, well, he let that version of himself die, but here he is doing those things that he could do before. And it's this remarkable, just sort of tension there, right?
There's a tension. He's embracing the tension. There's the tension. And even though he's talking about not fighting and accepting, I don't believe, and he's a palliative care specialist, I think the not fighting part is know that you were going to die. Okay, yes. But I don't think it's think it every moment. And I don't think he was trying to convey that. I think that tension he's conveying is, as you say, it's not about looking in the mirror and saying, I'm going to die. It's about looking in the mirror.
Yeah.
Who are you? What are you doing? Why are you doing it? Those are the basic ontological
and
existential questions.
One thing that he talks about during that is that, he says, my case is extreme, but it's just a variation on a theme. We all face struggle and loss, and it's how we adapt to it.
Yeah. And that was terrific.
Yeah. And you and I have talked about that on a show that we did relatively recently on aging, where we talked about, I think that difference, right, between denial of aging and death and a healthy acceptance, although it seems very just like a very minute distinction, it's a very important one, right? Because I think the example that I brought up was my knee, right? I'm a very active person physically. And I've talked about, I think in that episode we talked about how, it's difficult as you get older, and I'm not old, but I'm older.
No, but you're dwelling closer to Hemsworth than I am.
Yes, but as you get a little bit older, and as you start to do you do these physical things, and you go, I can't do what I once could, right? I think that somebody who's fighting it, somebody who's denying it, right? Somebody who I have been, tries to push past it and hurts themselves, right? And then tries to not accept that and tries to come back too quick and hurts themselves again, and then puts themselves in a bad headspace, and then it continues from there. It's not healthy. Yeah. But somebody who accepts aging and death, but who also accepts life and what it is, right? Says, you know what, my knee's not going to be able to do what it once did. My whole body is not going to be able to do what it once did, but it can still do something. And as long as I'm breathing, I'm going to do whatever I can with it.
Yeah. Right? What can you do that you didn't do before? And I think that's part of what I took away from it. If Chris Hemsworth, I can't speak to what's going through his mind. He was, I think, authentic and courageous to do this on a camera. There'd be some people who say, well, yeah, but look at I'm sure he's made lots of money from National Geographic. I'm not interested in that. He did things that he earned money for. He did his work. But he did his work beyond his work by opening himself to this when he didn't have to do it, and therefore to get people thinking and talking about this. And I think he deserves credit for that. But it's for me, at this place in life that I've been extremely fortunate to be in, I'm thinking of your knee thing, and it's not the loss of what I can't do anymore, because all the way through my adult life, there have been things that I've done and that I'm now doing that I couldn't or chose not to or didn't pursue the discipline of doing that I have now, that the younger me didn't. And some of that is just the nature of progression and family and so on. But some of it is, no, I really do want to try this now. And, with my art, it's just an amazingly self-energizing thing where I want to. A marvelous human being says, hey, you were my teacher. You want to have conversations every week? And the gift of that, Joel, has never left me. And it gives me opportunity and motive to think hard all week long to come and do this. So we're not just spouting off the tops of our heads, or to have a conversation each week with somebody who's a master in theater and dramaturgy and read plays that I've never read before. Now, I'm not going to go out and teach plays anymore officially, or to have opportunities to work with students in ways that are sort of like the troll under the bridge. I'm outside the system, and yet those wouldn't have been happening. And I feel very, very joyful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, one of the guys that Chris talks to is Gary, this guy who was a kung fu master when he was young, and he hurt himself, and he ended up getting into Tai Chi when he's older, And, I think that in the past, a younger version of me would have thought, okay, well, here's a guy he's just doing Tai Chi because he can't do kung fu anymore, and that's great, good for him, right? But the way that the story is told, you can tell, and he has this line that he says where he goes, sometimes you find that as you get smaller, you find something deeper that is more precious than anything that you had before, right?
Yes.
And you go, that's life, right? Is this thing where the only time, I think the only time where you can say that life is bad, right, is if you've closed yourself off to new things, right? And that can happen at any age. You don't have to be old and physically or mentally, disabled.
No.
Right. Your world doesn't have to become small for that to happen. It can happen to people at any age if you're not exploring. And I think about, the most enriching experiences of my life. You were talking this morning before we got on the show about how there's a chicken barbecue in town, right? And I remember being a kid, between the ages of about 6 and 12. My next door neighbor was an old World War II vet, and he was one of my best friends. I spent a lot of time up there. It reminds me of that because he had a framed newspaper on his wall of him, John Keller, hosting the Perry Chicken Barbecue, right? Yeah. But he had a wood shop, and him and we would just always build furniture, and we'd sit and I'd always want to get out to the wood shop. I'd come in and go, hey, what are you building? And it was kind of a game we played, right? Because he was in his 80s. So I'd show up and he'd be drinking his coffee at the table, and I'd sit down and I'd just be buzzing with energy, just a kid. And I wanted to get out to the wood shop, but I didn't want to broach it too soon because I knew I'd get shot down. That was always my in. I'd ask, so what are you doing out in the wood shop? And go, why don't we just sit and talk a couple more minutes, right? I'm not done with my coffee, and I think Pearl has a pecan pie that she made. You want a slice? And I hated pecans, but she made a good pie, so I'd suffer through the pecans to eat the pie, and I'd hear him talk about stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then we'd go out to the wood shop and we'd build things. But the whole experience, right? The talks that I didn't care much about ended up being these precious memories that I have now, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just starting to get to the age where I have younger friends, right? Mm-hmm. My whole life, I've had this diversity of people that I was friends with, people my age, people who are a little older, people who are a lot older, right? Yeah. And now I'm getting to the age where I'm starting to have friends who are younger, right? Mm-hmm. And my whole life I've done different things. And I'm starting to get to that age where I'm going, well, what's the next thing, right? And it's not an age. It's not a stage in life. No. And psychology is starting to debunk this idea of stages of life and these different things.
About time.
But at every stage in your life, right, you look in the mirror and you go, this is my life. This is it. What am I going to do with it, right? Yeah. Am I going to do the same things that I always did? And if that's something that brings you joy, and if you have new ways of experiencing it, that's great. But if it's something that you're just going through, then you're closer to death than some of these people who are older that are trying and experiencing new things.
Did I bombard you with the thing that I did with so many students? And if any of them ever remember it, then they'll just shake their heads. But the little mini lecture on, I hear people, I still do hear people say this. Well, I went to high school. I got that out of the way. Now I'm going to college. Why? So I can get it out of the way. And some of my students were slightly older students, and they're saying, well, I had my kids, so I got that out of the way. Hmm. And the common theme, and I was trying to point to people, is if you're pushing all of these things out of the way as if they're all obstacles, then what are you headed toward? Hmm. If every single thing that could be a point of deep and abidingly challenging and wondrous experience, it's just something you're getting out of the way. What are you after? And that's a deep question that nobody can answer for anybody else but for them. But this idea is rampant in our culture.
Yeah, and Chris has one of those moments after he hears B.J. Miller's story. He says, here's a guy who everybody envies, right? And he says, for the past 10 or 12 years, I've just been working so hard that all my memories are in fast forward, and I don't spend enough time with my family. And he starts to cry, right? He starts to break up, and you go, again, right? It doesn't matter what your status is in life or what you have or what you don't have. Right. We all look in that mirror and say, this is my life. What am I doing with it, right? That's an important question. And I think that it dovetails into another one of his guests, where, Chris after meeting a young woman with cancer, he learns the importance of living in the moment, right? And that's something that she talks about. And this comes back to what we were talking about earlier, where she says, every day I've thought about dying, right? And you and I were just talking about how, there's no value to dwelling on this, right? But she's in a situation where it's always there. Again, is this another area where there's a fine distinction between a healthy and an unhealthy way of approaching it?
I think so, because her story is deeply moving, as it is for anyone. Many philosophers and psychologists and doctors and so on write about this. Somehow we have this scale of value. If it's a child or a young person, somebody who's barely out of adolescence, which is 27, as we know about development now, at least, it doesn't seem right, as if right has anything to do with it. But it puts us in a position of thinking, and how many times have I done this with writers? You can't be a student of literature without how many writers and artists have died at half my age or a quarter of my age, and what they did and all those things. So yeah, she's thinking about it because she has a terminal diagnosis. And to see how he responded to that, it was deeply sensitive. He was attentive, and authentically so. This moved him. And certainly she was giving him a gift. Yeah. And he was receiving it. But it takes me back to something else that you were talking about. I think if I had to single it out, the single greatest energizer is having friends, dear people in your life of all ages. I grew up with a lot of people aging and aging not well because of a lot of life circumstances, and it affected me. It has always affected me. So I have thought about age and death since I was 12, and so it's not. It's not the situation that everybody, and I don't mean brutal, awful, violent. It's just people when you grew up in a place that was essentially pre-Appalachian, meaning at the edge of the mountains, so to speak, where people have to scrap and scurry to put a life together, and you see the results of hard work with a lead foundry, one of my grandfathers, exposed to all kinds of things without any masking, without any, and how do you deal with that afterward? Well, maybe you smoke a lot, maybe you drink a lot, so a lot of decay and a lot of destruction at a time, I know what age I am and what age I'm older than one of my grandfathers ever made it to. And you see that, but then because I was teaching, and because I never aimed to be friends with students, but it was always a joy when a friendship would develop post-graduation or post, and you have these folks in your life who, it eventually probably won't happen for me, was it people in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s and their 50s and my age, all clusters of friends, many at a distance now, all the way up through 85. My friend in Florida, and my dad, and so I'm with a 4-year-old, hours and hours, many days a week, talking, and by the end of the day, I'm talking to somebody who's an octogenarian, and that inevitably, the fusion energy that creates of perspectives and how people are seeing things, I think it keeps you really alive.
Yeah, I think so. And it's funny, I don't think there's no set path to getting there, right? Because I think that mine is probably almost diametrically opposed to you, right? Like when I was young, I knew a lot of older people. I mentioned my next door neighbor. My parents and grandparents were a little bit older when they had children, so my grandparents were all already older. just a lot of different people I knew that were older, that were aging very, very well, and lived very, very long lives. So I didn't really deal with any death until I was a teenager. But throughout my life, I had been exposed to a lot of older people that aged very well. And that created a very positive impact of aging for me, right? I always idolized these older characters, the Gandalfs and the Obi-Wan Kenobis. And I thought, I can't wait to be old. Being old is going to be so cool, right? And then when I got to be an older teenager, and then through to now, right? So for over the past 15 years, there's been pretty much a rapid fire experience of death, right? All these older people that I knew died, as well as my dad, who was not older, right? He had this sort of tragic disease that took him pretty young, right? And I think that it's funny because the perspective shifted a little bit, but I think I already had all this exposure to aging, and I saw all these people who were old from a very young age, and I had friendships, right? Not just these sorts of things where your mom dragged you along to church, but these things where I was having conversations, I was engaging with these people, and I had this positive view of aging. And then when they started to die, I had to refocus that a little bit and think, okay, so this is what the end is, right? And I saw over and over again, this is what the end is like. This is what the end is like. And it wasn't similar across all circumstances, right? Every one of them died in a different way. Every one of them had a different experience. But I think, what it did for me from the first time was I've thought about death every day for the past 15 years. But I think that it's been a healthy thing for me, right? Because I haven't been dwelling on it. I haven't been sitting here thinking, like you said, it's going to happen any minute, or, oh man, is it going to be terrible Alzheimer's, or is it going to be a painful car accident that's going to be prolonged, or what's it going to be? I haven't been thinking about that. But what I think about every day is my time is limited, right? Just that simple idea, right? My time is limited, right? And then what am I going to do with it? It's that looking in the mirror. This is my life, right? And I think that a lot of people don't have that reminder that it's finite. And I'm not sure why that is, because I'm sure that everybody deals with people of different ages and everybody deals with death.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a mental block, whether it's cultural or whether it's biological or there's something that is.
I think it's partly cultural, and this will seem like it's low hanging fruit to attack, and I don't intend it to be that. But we have up until well, still really now, although not as in exactly the same way. I think we're transitioning. We've had this cult of youth, and I think that's what the Hemsworth thing was about too.
Mm-hmm.
So he's talking to these old people. This guy who became a chief because his brother died in I think it was the Philippines,
Fiji,
Fiji, and he's hearing stories. To hear stories, to take stories in, it's what our whole humanities. It's what the arts are about. Every branch of the humanities is about storytelling through arts, music, literature, stage, and here he was encountering stories directly, not wearing a mask and just directly, and people who didn't know who he was, and that was I think the terrific thing. Some of them did, but most of them they talked. Do you know who I am? Or do you know who Chris Hemsworth? No.
Yeah.
and to be able to encounter somebody like that, I think was terrific. And I just lost my train, but
he makes a really interesting observation at the end of his first day where he goes, the thing that bugged me is all these people, talking to me like I'm an old person. He goes, I don't, I hope I don't do that. Right. And I think that's anybody who has had, an honest, genuine exchange with an older person, right, realizes that you only get a couple sentences in and that age difference disappears, right?
Yes.
You have this preconception about what old people are like, right? But then when you start talking, you realize that these are just people. They're not old people. They're just people. And I think that probably another experience that had Chris in that mindset was he sees his wife aged 50 years.
Yeah, right? That was pretty incredible because they did a professional. She was afraid with it because they were doing a professional makeup job, the prosthetics for the face. The whole thing.
It's very convincing. She looked very old. And, I think that during that scene, right, I think that most of us that are watching it aren't seeing Chris Hemsworth and his wife. We're seeing ourselves and our significant others, right? Yes. Ourselves and the people who are important to us. And I think that idea of projecting that into the future and seeing the people that you love as older people, all of a sudden you realize that no, it doesn't make any difference, right? It doesn't make any difference that they're old. Yeah. These are the people that I love. These are the people in my life.
Yes.
And the age doesn't change who they are in a way that, we all change over time, right? And that's something that we adapt to, but the age isn't a significant part of how we view them.
Yeah, that was a very sweet, vulnerable moment because he didn't know they were doing that and she was afraid of how he would respond.
Mm.
And he didn't just, put on this brave face when he was going to go. They said he had a dance partner for the dance he was going to, and don't worry because your wife doesn't know anything about this. So he's game, and they lead him over, and she turns around, and you could tell she was scared.
Yeah,
in her eyes, and he looks, and then he recognizes her, and he's just like that.
Mm.
And the fact that he could meant that part of this is this experience that he's been having. That he would recognize her because there are pictures of him old, made into the computer generated old version. But he's also an actor, and actors are trained variously. But I think one of the things, if you're trained well and you study well, is you are attentive to details. You recognize what a slight raise of an eyebrow might mean. You are thinking about that for yourself, and you're seeing it in somebody else. So, of course, he recognized her eyes.
He says an interesting thing when he sits down with her, which was the first thing he says to her is, as soon as I touched your shoulder, I said, I know who this person is, right? And that really, that beautiful moment sort of demonstrates this idea, right? That age plays such a small part in how we interact with the people that we love. But
this culture of youth is I'm just quick on that, but it's just I'm seeing. Well, I watch Star Trek. Well, it's on Paramount, so you get advertisements. Mostly the streaming, I'm so used to not having advertisements. It's nice, but I saw last night watching episodes of Picard. I saw advertisement after advertisement for people of all body shapes, for people of all ages. And it wasn't all medical stuff. Oh, here's a pill to take. Oh, here's the next thing. It wasn't. And I thought, this is different. I have not experienced the celebration of everybody doesn't have to look thin as a rail or whatever it has to be. But there's so much concentration on that that's part of the reason we veer away from old people.
Yeah.
I think that we're supposed to be frightened of their craggy features or the fact that their faces are sagging or whatever it is, or it's not standing up straight. Anything is a reminder that somehow their bodies are changing has been a point of fright, often for kids, that isn't talked about. And this is what Mary Midgley, the philosopher, talks about. Many philosophers talk about this now. That if we would only have conversations with people, as you were just saying, and you get through that threshold, it's the superficial stuff that really bothers me. And I'm at the stage where it's beginning to happen, where I'll go in and have a transaction in the store. There you go, honey. Don't call me honey. You don't know me. That's demeaning. I know you intend to do it well. That's or it's just a way to, but no, because that's infantilizing. That's, we'll just be really nice to you because after all, you're getting old. I'd say something, but I can't.
Yeah, and that's what this scene, the whole episode, but especially this scene with his wife demonstrates is just, again, that even if, and with him wearing the aging suit, okay, he can't see as well, he can't hear as well, he can't move around as well, but he's still Chris Hemsworth, right? He's still that person.
Yeah.
And her experience, Elsa experience with it is even more interesting because you can tell from the beginning she is more sensitive to this topic than he is. The very first scene, they're driving in their car up to this retirement facility, and she says, I think Chris is underestimating aging. I think that when the 3 days is up, he's going to want to get out of there as fast as he can. Because she's 7 years older than he is. So at the time of filming, she's already a woman in her mid-40s, right? Yeah. And she talks about that during the prosthetics and you know, the makeup of her when they're aging her. She says, you know, that society is much harder on women aging. And so there's a very good chance that, you know, in addition to being 7 years older, her experience, you know, the culturalization throughout her life and Chris's life versus aging for men and aging for women represents two different scenarios, right? Again, like I said, when I was a kid, there was Obi-Wan Kenobis, there was Gandalfs, there was old men that I could look to and say, yeah, I can't wait to be like that when I'm older, right? That doesn't exist for women in as many ways. You know, I think that we're starting to make some progress, but I think there's still a significant gap in how gender is involved in. I mean,
Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin and Sally Field and well, there's a lot of people, a lot of older actresses are taught. Helen Mirren, who have talked about how finding roles even is but now those roles are emerging because our population is getting old.
Yeah.
So,
do you think it's true that we fear the loss of loved ones more than we do our own death? At one point, B.J. Miller says that in the episode.
I do.
Yeah, I have an interesting, you know, again, as somebody who has thought about death pretty much every day, right, over the past 15 years, it was funny because Chris asked the young woman with cancer, you know, have you accepted your mortality? And before she answered, I knew what she was going to say. And I think that's because anybody who's thought about it for a long period of time comes to the same conclusion. Yes and no, right?
Yeah.
I think the more you think about it, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, the more you think about it, the more the shock value wears off a little bit, right? The same way it is with anything that we talk about, right? We talk about a lot of topics that have to do with experiences of awe or sublime or things that are bigger than the human experience. Right? That's what philosophy is. And so the more you engage with those topics, the less they have that shocking impact to you.
Yeah.
But they never lose that piece that it, and I don't think that they can lose them unless you figure them out, which is impossible, right? If you can't figure out death, if you can't figure out time, if you can't figure out God, if you can't figure these things out, there's always going to be an element of them that you can't fully wrap your head around.
It's a mystery. Capital M, the ancient word. But
so I think that, so I think that coming back to the question, I think that we fear our loved ones' deaths because if you go through life, you experience death. And so you understand conceptually and in a concrete fashion what death is, and you can see that and imagine that happening to one of your loved ones. But your own death, you can't conceive of in the same fashion. And so I think that it is natural to fear the loss of your loved ones more than yourself because you can't conceptualize. We
don't want to be without
yourself.
them, and we can't really conceptualize the loss of ourselves. And I think Mary Midgley is right in this too, and others who have talked about this, that it's the error was for Epicurus and some of the earlier philosophers from her view. The error is in thinking that what we fear is pain. Well, the actual moment of passing is not that long. If you've been with someone, you realize this. But the suffering somebody might actually be experienced going into it. Yes, there's that pain, but she's asserting, and I feel this. I think this is right. That the fear is nothingness.
Yeah.
Which is why religion works for people, I think. But then that gets us into an entirely different question. Is death natural? Because if death is natural, then it's just a part of our bodies, and as you say, accumulation and a cascade of causes and effects. If death is not just natural, meaning there's some supernatural element involved, then we get into the punitive nature of death, which didn't start with the Adam and Eve story. It was part of earlier cultures where death is punishment. But it's certainly built into the Christian tradition. And so that removes it from the natural. So is death natural? Well, not necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's funny because the beliefs you have about these things will change the course of your whole life, right? That's the thing that always bothered me about some of the Christian rhetoric was, there's this notion that, okay, well, if you're a Christian, you're going to experience a life of suffering and persecution, but it's all right because it'll pay off after you're dead. Think about if you're wrong. Think about if there is nothingness after you die. How have you spent your life, right? Which isn't to say that to be Christian means that you have to accept that attitude.
No, not at all.
You can certainly embrace life and be a Christian.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that kind of rhetoric is what always bothered me. This idea that, oh, okay, well, don't worry about this life. It's gonna pay off next time, right? And I think that is a powerful tool of religions, of governments, of economic systems.
That's a tool of manipulation. That's a tool of keeping people, just keep your nose to the grindstone, just do what you're supposed to do. You're going to hurt. It's okay. You'll have paradise afterward. Yeah. And not every Christian, no, we're not speaking in blanket terms, but the idea is there.
Yeah.
And therefore, in some way, has to be dealt with. So that's one of those questions. Does death destroy meaning, or does it create it? That's a question that I often have.
Yeah. And I think we talked about this maybe once way, way back towards the beginning of the show, talking about if there was no death, right, would life have any meaning? If we were immortal, right? If there's no way for us to die, again, where philosophy flourishes for me, especially in conversations like this, is in the extreme hypotheticals.
Yep.
So if there's no resource limitations, there's no cosmic interference, we would just continue to live forever in a state similar to this. Would life have any meaning, right? And you think, well, even if I have the most healthy attitude, right? I'm always going to try new things. I'm always going to meet new people. I'm always going to do new things. Forever is just such a long time that, we
can't conceive.
Right. And again, my mind always goes to music, right? I look at these frequency waves. As you and I are talking, we see the little bouncing needles of our voices and stuff. But an interesting thing happens if I stretch out, right, like the tempo, or if I stretch out the time frame of it, all of a sudden these peaks and valleys of our voices get very flat until it's just a straight line. Just a flat line, zero heartbeat, right?
I'm trying to hold my breath right now, watch the line.
Right. And so it wouldn't matter. We could have this conversation and it looks like this healthy conversation on the screen. But if I stop it, right, and then I stretch it out and I make it 26 hours long, it would just be a flat line. There would be nothing, right? And to me, that's almost a good metaphor of what the issue with immortality is, right? I think the death, that limitation, we've talked about in all kinds of creative endeavors, right? Limitation is what gives inspiration a foothold, right? You say, I can't do that, so I'm going to do this, right?
Right.
We talked about creating melodies, right? Daniel Dennett, right? If you just sit down at a keyboard, you can write anything you want. There's nothing there, right? You have to have something that you can work with, some guiding
Negative
frame of reference.
space. Negative space is what guides a painting or a drawing. And this is a big negative space, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's difficult, right? Does death create meaning, right? And I think you want to say, well, no, life creates meaning. But I think that life and death in a very Eastern philosophy sort of way are this yin and yang. It's this thing that you can't have one without the other in the way that we conceptualize.
And here's the other, you talk about the extreme stuff. So I think about this often. And it comes to this. If, as I've said to you before, for me, if there were a post-death paradisical experience, it would be a library, an art studio, endless fresh paths to walk, and conversations to have. Now, I know of no tradition in which that is the afterlife. And I think when people say, well, I'm going to be with all my loved ones forever. Yeah, well, how are you going to be with them? Because, if our loved ones is just the perfect version of all of us, then it's bland. Are we going to sit and just look at each other and smile? That's a nightmare. Or just sing all the time? That's a nightmare. So I'm not interested in those versions of paradise because they don't mean anything to me in any positive way.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing that the episode didn't really dive into. At one point, the death doula asks him what he thinks about what his thoughts are on what happens after death. And he doesn't really have any, right? He just talks about how as a kid, he tried to conceptualize nothing and it freaked him out, kept him up at night.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's the difficult part, right? This is where the philosophy really takes hold in each one of us, is this idea of, is there nothing after I die? Yes or no? And that creates a scary scenario. But if there isn't nothing, if there's something, what is that something? And that creates an equally scary scenario, right? Trying to develop even the most ideal scenario of what paradise would be is frightening. And I think that the only way you get out of that frightening scenario is if you put a limitation on paradise, right? I think anything that we conceptualize as lasting forever becomes a nightmare in some way.
You said that very well. Did you read the Alua is her name, the death doula? There was an interview with her.
No, I didn't see that.
All right. And she's talking about having talked to Chris Hemsworth. She said, I think the part of the challenge we have in society is because since people's relationships with death and dying, with grief, with all the rationale is all quite normalized, there's still a big stigma around even being curious about how we die or my own death. And so people tend to shut it away and not really discuss it. And my work really gives people permission to talk about that. But she says, my truth is that I can understand why people would be scared, but it's not necessarily my job to help people get over it, but rather to be with people where they are in their conversations around it. They're just normalizing it by conversing about it. They're not trying to solve it. They're not trying to say you should be a certain way. Although my impression in the episode, the thing that bothered me is when she was having him recite, I am ending, there is nothing. All that I have known is gone. It's like things like that. And I'm thinking, what a lonely way to have the last moment. I think of my last moment with my father's mother, my grandmother, who did live. She was the one who did live longest, into her 90s. And I was with her at a nursing home she was in very briefly, and talking a little bit with her, and that night she died. But I brought my harmonica, and she loved Red River Valley, and she asked me to play, and I did. And then the last words before "I love you" were, she said, "Dance." She stretched out her hand, and I held her hand, and I played Red River Valley, and moved my arm, and then I gave her a kiss, and she fell asleep. Well, she died a few hours later. That wasn't frightening. Now, maybe she did that for me, but I think she was doing that for herself too. I think it was a way of something meaningful before everything stopped.
Yeah.
But I don't know if everything stopped.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, in the course of my psychology studies, there's been some very interesting research into near-death experiences. And by near-death, they don't mean necessarily
light.
Right. And it doesn't necessarily mean somebody who has an accident and then comes back to everyday life, but it's a study of the natural progression of dying, and then looking at the empirical and tangible elements of what that process is like if somebody doesn't return from it, if somebody actually dies, and what happens. And what they find is that in the preceding days leading up to it, the person who's dying has increasingly meaningful experiences, usually in the form of dreams of predeceased loved ones coming to visit them, and an experience, demonstrating some of the behaviors that you mentioned, where even though they may be very close to death, still wanting to emulate or experience things that they love doing in the past, And you go, the question that the researcher raised, and you could tell that it haunted him a little bit, right? Is he goes, the question is, does this behavior arise as some sort of biological defense mechanism against death, or does it point to something supernatural about it, right? That's philosophy, right? That's the whole discussion of it, and that's what makes it so interesting. But it's something that everybody has to confront on their own, right? Yeah. And it was really just whether it was this TV show or the research I was looking at or the experience that I've had personally, it's always been something that has been very fascinating to me, right?
It is, and it will continue to be until it isn't.
So we, again, if you want to watch it right now, it's on Disney Plus. I don't know when you listen to this in the future, but and we barely scratched the surface of a lot of the things that happened in it. Is there anything you want to, any final takeaways, anything that you were itching to talk about that we didn't cover?
I think really not. I think it's those last moments when he's reciting what the death school is saying to him, when he goes through the door.
Yeah.
And I was uncertain about this. They showed a bunch of ambulance guys grabbing him, putting on a bed. I mean, if they did that to him, if they went through all of that, if they took him to a hospital, then they brought him back there, or how that was unclear to me. What was going on? Were they describing this to him, or did they actually physically put him through all that? And that bothered me a little bit, because everything else was so crystal clear and upfront, and that was collapsed into this melange of images. So that bothered me a bit. Yeah.
I think there was, I think that going into it, B.J. Miller there said this is where we're stretching the immersive theater to its max. So I think in that room, I think that they must have had a bunch of costume and lighting changes and things going on to try to simulate it. That's what I think might have happened.
That's what immersive theater would be. And so you're right. It's probably always in that room.
But there was, that whole scene, that end scene, there was definitely a lot of, they edited some things together to make the television viewer's experience more immersive and powerful, I think. And trying to picture what Chris was going through at the same time, it must have been something pretty different. But it was. I think that's where the format ran up against some of the limitations of the medium. But I think that from the viewer's perspective, they did a really good job. I think that it was.
And how about you? Do you have something else that's on your mind with it?
No, I think that we really did cover most of the stuff I wanted to talk about with it. Really, there's just those couple of big topics that arose. This idea of how do you let go? How do you embrace death without obsessing about it, right? How do you think about aging and aged, people, all those different things that we talked about. I think that those are the main takeaways and the big points. And I think we did a good job covering them. So until next time, keep pondering.